Hello and welcome to Original Soundchat, where video game music is a work of art. On each episode, it's our goal to help you learn about 2 soundtracks from the world of games, as well as the people, stories, and critical tracks behind them. My name is DeVader.
And I'm Peter Spezia. We're brought to you by Anonymous Dinosaur and Rhymes with Asia. It's time to appreciate great OSTs and the games that they come from without getting too bogged down in music theory. Joe, what are this week's games?
Up first is 2006's Rule of Rose, the story of a young woman trapped on an airship with the world's worst gang of children, accompanied by a haunting strings soundtrack and a moral panic controversy.
Following that is the classic 16-bit platformer, with the adventure to rescue Princess Toadstool from Bowser and the Koopalings, as one of the most impactful console launch titles of all time, 1990's Super Mario World. Yep, I think Terrible Children is a good through line to go for these two games, though I'm sure the Koopalings don't really play as big a role in Super Mario World compared to what sound like the children in Rule of Rose.
Yeah, at least the Koopalings have like the benefit of being evil. They're evil because they work for an evil guy. Because remember, they're not Bowser's kids. Wasn't that confirmed like a couple years ago? Miyamoto was like, oh yeah, no, they're not Bowser's kids.
Yeah, surprisingly recently.
But the children in Rule of Rose are just, I guess you could call them evil, but they're kind of just bullies. So,
I mean, hey, they're pretty different games other than that, so we'll make it work. Sounds good to me. Joe, how are you doing? What are you playing?
The only thing I really played in the past week was the game I mentioned last week, the review game that I couldn't talk about yet, being Long Gone Days. The review is up already. It is an RPG from a Chilean studio that is supposed to be about like war from a civilian and refugee viewpoint, essentially. It's fine. I gave it a 7. I'm not going to say that people should like rush out and play it, but if you like RPGs, I mean, it's got a pretty neat battle system, so.
Feels like it's probably hitting a little too close to current events in the world right now, though.
Yeah, fun fact, takes place in Russia and then ends in Poland.
So I have been coming off of being sick, still kind of feeling like the last 10% of it, but that meant I spent all weekend playing way too much of Final Fantasy 16 and finishing it, doing a 100% completion on the quests and the hunt board creatures and all of that stuff. It's really interesting to go back then and hear critique of the game, because I kind of agree that if they had picked to make this game like a full-on action game or a full-on RPG, it would have been better either way. Probably better if they leaned in more to the action game, but because they try to do both, it suffers a little bit for it. That said, it is an incredible spectacle. Yoshi P and team did the darn thing. They made a pretty great game overall, and Masayoshi Soken with just an amazing soundtrack. That is going to be tough to beat on my personal list for best of 2023, which will go in hand with yours as we make our big old list there. But it's really tough to make a critical 5 for this game, because there's like 7 or 8 tracks that I feel like really have a good reasoning for being in a critical 5. So we'll see how that all shakes out. And then I did about the first hour or so in Assassin's Creed Mirage, got to the title splash, past all the tutorials when you get to Baghdad. Fun time so far, but it's still super early. Also, don't sleep on the game having the option of Arabic voiceover. It adds something to it, I think, as far as just kind of being in and living in that environment. And of course, you put subtitles on and that helps, but there's something to that. You got to download an Arabic voice pack to do it, but it's pretty neat.
I was not actually aware that was a thing. That sounds kind of neat, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like the first to have that language offered for Assassin's Creed in the franchise. So what a time to do it. Pretty neat.
All right, we are once again recording earlier than usual. And honestly, there also has not been a ton of game news in general in the past 2 weeks, essentially. I haven't seen much. Well, not game news that we would be talking about on this show. There has certainly been other game news that is a downer. But we don't have any composer follow-up news to talk about. That's the point I'm trying to get to. So we're going to just jump into my game right away. And that game is Rule of Rose, which was originally released for PlayStation 2 on January 19th, 2006 in Japan, September 12th, 2006 in North America, and then November 3rd, 2006 in Europe. It was developed by Punchline and published by Sony Computer Entertainment in Japan, Atlas USA in North America, and 505 Games in Europe. It is a survival horror game because remember, it's spooky season, and this is where I thrive in my environment. In this game, you take control of a young lady named Jennifer. Now you might be asking, Joe, haven't you already talked about the horror games starring a young lady named Jennifer? You're thinking of 1995's Clock Tower, which I talked about in episode 88. Jennifer led a happy life until, unfortunately, losing her parents in an accident, and as a result, she is sent off to live at an orphanage. But on the bus ride there, she encounters a mysterious young boy who hands her a seemingly unfinished storybook and asks her to tell him how it ends. Before she has a chance to respond, the boy runs off the bus, and Jennifer follows him, ending up at the rundown Rose Garden Orphanage. Before she's able to enter the orphanage's front gate, she is greeted by the sight of a group of masked children beating something inside of a bloody brown sack. Obviously afraid of this, Jennifer enters through the back just in time to hear the announcement of a funeral in the yard for her, quote, dear friend. Entering the yard, she finds a shovel, which she uses to dig up the freshly buried coffin, but before she is able to investigate the coffin, which contains the sack from earlier, she is pushed into it, and it's closed as she slowly loses consciousness. When she awakes, she finds herself on an airship, and she learns that she has been taken captive by a boy calling himself the Prince of the Red Rose, of the Red Rose Aristocrats, or the Red Crown Aristocrats as they are called, which is a social hierarchy of the children on the ship, which Jennifer has now unwittingly been declared the lowest member of. The rules of the ship are simple. Every month, the Aristocrat Club demands a gift or offering, specifying what they want on a poster hung on the door to their meeting room. And while searching for the first month's gift, a beautiful butterfly, Jennifer finds and rescues a Labrador named Brown, who then becomes Jennifer's only companion on the airship. Together they must find the gifts that the higher class members demand and survive their time with the Red Rose aristocracy. Now you might also be saying, wait, okay, Joe, I know you've talked about the horror game where a young lady is trapped somewhere against her will and her only companion is a dog that she rescues. Well, you're thinking of 2005's Haunting Ground, which I talked about in episode 195. So that's like direct comparisons to two games I've talked about in the past. And Rule of Rose in general kind of plays exactly like most other games in its genre. The closest comparisons that I could think of being Silent Hill or Haunting Ground. Honestly, Haunting Ground's probably a bit closer. You explore environments, you pick up items that you use to help solve puzzles. You avoid or fight various enemies, which are usually in the form of these tiny, like, ghastly imp children. Like, zombie, weird... It's bizarre. But a unique mechanic to the game, the one that kind of sets it apart from those, is the find mechanic, where you can take an item in your inventory, and you can put it in your find slot, and anything that's in the find slot, you can then instruct Brown to track down something based on the scent of that item in your inventory. So let's say you want to find some biscuits, which are one of the health items in the game. You would then put a biscuit tin, or a biscuit, honestly, in your find tab. You'll tell Brown to go, and Brown will then, if there are any in the area, lead you to something related to that item. And you do that a lot because it's kind of some of the only guidance the player gets in the entire game. So you need to make a lot of use of that. So the questions become, what is the true purpose of the Red Rose aristocrats? And why are they so awful to Jennifer in particular? Who is the Prince of the Red Rose? Can Jennifer survive her time on this airship full of the world's worst children? And why do those terrible children seem to know something about Jennifer that she doesn't? This is where I will ask, what are your experiences with Rule of Rose?
Honestly, not a game I've ever heard of until you put it on the list for this year and started talking about how you were trying to play it. It's weird. It kind of falls into this like end of PlayStation 2, right before the launch of PlayStation 3 window. And looks like Brown is a terrible name for a dog, even though he sounds like a good boy and pretty essential for the game.
He's a very good boy. I agree that Brown is a stupid name for a dog. Huey is much better.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But for me, yeah, I tried to play the game. I got to the first boss, which is in the second chapter, and tried to fight it one time, lost, and that one time was enough for me to say, hey, I don't want to play this game anymore. Because the combat in Rule of Rose is terrible, and it should not have boss fights. At all. I believe people when they say that the plot of Rule of Rose is very good. We will get into what critics thought of the game later. But playing it sucks. It looks nice. It sounds nice. It's written nicely. Playing it is terrible. So yeah, I made it to like near the end of chapter 2, at which point I decided to drop it. And that's my experience with Rule of Rose. I actually learned about this game because of the Super Best Friends. Years and years ago, they used to do a thing every October called and excuse the language, we usually don't say things like this on this show, the Shitstorm of Scariness, where essentially they would do a like 1 hour quick look at a different horror game every day of October. And during the first one, Rule of Rose was one of the ones they looked at, and I had always been kind of curious about it since then. And then I was reminded about it because of a developer that we have talked about actually mentioning Rule of Rose relatively recently. So we will get into that as well. But yeah, it's always been a curiosity for me. I associate it a lot with Haunting Ground, even before I knew the main character's name was Jennifer, and even before I knew there was a dog involved.
Yeah. I just, whenever I think of an alliterative title with R's and Rose in there, I think of Rumble Roses, and I'm like, oh, that's not the same game at all, remotely.
Very different game. So let's talk about the development of Rule of Rose, which is actually the second most interesting thing that I learned about while doing this research. So Punchline began developing Rule of Rose after being specifically asked by Sony if they would make them a horror game, which was a weird choice on Sony's part, because Punchline's only other game up to this point and after this point was Tulip. Tulip is a game you've probably not heard of. I only heard about it because of Game Grumps played it for like 20 minutes once. It is a very rare game. You can't find it anywhere anymore. But it's a game about making friends and kissing everyone in town. So obviously, these are the people you would go to ask to make you a horror game now.
Oh, I have seen this, and yes, only because of Game Grumps, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. I would not know this game existed had it not been for them. So, their first goal when they started the project was to make sure they weren't just making Resident Evil. They didn't want to do like any slasher stuff. They didn't want to do any zombies. Nothing like that. They wanted to make what they called a, quote, new type of horror game. They didn't really do that, but we'll get into that. And their first concept was actually a game about a young boy having been abducted by an adult, and the boy trying to escape his abductor while encountering the ghosts of his previous victims. Which sounds interesting, and Sony turned it down because they were afraid that the concept might have some topics that were a bit dangerous. And honestly, while I think that game sounds interesting, Sony is correct in saying that.
Yeah, I don't blame them. 20 years is a long time, and I feel like we wouldn't have had the maturity to discuss things like that in games at that point. Maybe now, but even now, like that's tough for a big publisher to get behind, especially a first-party console manufacturer.
Mm-hmm. The keywords that they apparently went with for both that concept and carried over to what would become the final product were kidnapping, imprisonment, children, bullying, dwarfs, I don't know why that's there, airship, and escape. Genuinely not sure why dwarfs is there. I don't know what that could possibly be referring to. But
again, a more immature industry.
Yeah. So instead of their concept about the young boy having been abducted, they turned to the concept of fear between girls, which then led to a focus on children, with a specific idea being the portrayal of how children and adults can each find the other to be horrifying sometimes because of the differences in how an adult thinks versus how a child thinks. And the game has often been compared to Lord of the Flies because of its whole premise, but apparently it was not one of the game's inspirations. They did not look to Lord of the Flies while making this game.
How? I ask how with a child's society. Yeah, you're going to tell me that wasn't an inspiration for Hideo Kojima's Chapter 3 of Metal Gear Solid 5 that got cut. Like, obviously that was, but I find that a little hard to believe.
I mean, to be fair, a Japanese studio, it's possible they have not heard of Lord of the Flies.
I guess.
Possible. If it was a Western studio, yeah, no, you've heard of Lord of the Flies. That's... But in Japan, it's possible that story is just not as big. That being said, what they did do for inspiration was they went and did research on location. So they went to the UK. They visited Hyde Park in Westminster because they wanted to learn how gardens typically looked in England. They consulted with the British government and actually accessed archives to learn more about the R-101 airship, which is what the airship in the game is largely based on. And yeah, they just did a bunch of stuff in the UK to do all this research. Then during development, Brown was added in order to balance out the misery and helplessness and, quote, make the game more enjoyable.
Yeah, a dog will do that, I guess.
But then, unfortunately, their budget ran out, and so they did not have a chance to make the combat good. So Wikipedia says the combat was left, quote, a little rough, and that is the understatement of the century. People talk about how, like, Silent Hill has clunky combat, and that's on purpose because it's supposed to make the protagonist feel like a normal person. Rule of Rose makes Silent Hill look like Devil May Cry 5. It is bad. And also, the game uses a lot of visual filters over the camera, and this was directly inspired by Silent Hill. And they also went and researched not just England, but children. Because they wanted to get the child characters correct. They wanted them to feel like children. So they researched behavior in adolescence. They were able to go into something that let them monitor a group of European and American children, specifically. Then they had a group of children, like, use drawings or writing to express to the team what made them feel happy or made them feel afraid. Meanwhile, while they used like European and American children for all that, the motion capture was still done by Japanese child actors. So there's that. And the big themes they ended up wanting to go for was the, quote, intimate relationships between all people, but they also focused on the, again, difference in thinking between children and adults, which also led to the concept of what children might do if they were to be given power over the adults in their lives. Because there are adults in this game, but they are treated not great. There's also, much like Clock Tower and Haunting Ground, a large theme of helplessness, as there is nothing the player can do to prevent Jennifer from being bullied by the children on the ship.
Why am I also thinking Danganronpa, another episode where a girl gets stuck in a child society where they want power over the adults? Sometimes things get pretty similar thematically.
So now it's time to talk about the other part of this game's history, being the nonsense moral panic that surrounded it. First, only partially related to the rest of the stuff, Sony actually passed on publishing the game in North America. As I mentioned at the top, Atlas USA is who published it. And they claimed that if they were to publish it in North America, they would want its content to be toned down a little bit. And Punchline disagreed with this, believing that if they did so, it would just muddle the core themes of the game. So Atlas USA had to step up and publish instead. And then Europe happened. This is, I think, the stupidest moral panic I've ever read about. This makes Fox News' stuff on Mass Effect look like an intelligent conversation. An Italian magazine had somehow caught rumors that Rule of Rose featured violence towards children, which I guess, if you squint, I can see where they would have gotten that. Maybe? I don't know. Which were then picked up and expanded upon by who else but the British media, who claimed the game contained scenes of, quote, children buried alive underground, in-game sadomasochism, and underage eroticism. None of these are present in the game at all. Not a single one of those three things. But this was enough for a justice minister for the EU by the name of Franco Frattini, claiming that the game contained, quote, obscene cruelty and brutality and called for changes in PEGI's rating system when the game was officially only rated 16+, as he believed that they needed to change the rating system so that it would protect minors from obscene content, which led to Frattini receiving a letter from a commissioner for the Information Society and Media, that's how Wikipedia describes her. Her name was Vivian Redding, who criticized his remarks and reminded him that PEGI literally already did that and had been doing it for 3 years at that point. She also reminded him that part of PEGI's work was to make sure they were protecting minors from that content while also not infringing on freedom of expression in the process. Even so, a group of members of the European Parliament presented a motion to ban the sale of the game in Europe, with the strongest efforts being to ban it in Poland and France. Fun fact, the game hadn't even come out in Europe at this point. Nobody in Europe had played it at all. This motion failed, by the way, if you're wondering. And all of this, though, led to the cancellation of the release in Australia and New Zealand. And then later, they also canceled the UK release. In fact, the UK release was canceled so late that review outlets had actually already been sent review copies of the game. It was released in the rest of Europe. Every other country in Europe got it. This led to a quote from the Video Standards Council, who had given the game its PEGI 16+ rating in the first place, which was, quote, I have no idea where the suggestion of in-game sadomasochism has come from, nor children being buried underground. These are things that have been completely made up. We're not worried about our integrity being called into question because Mr. Frattini's quotes are nonsense. And the reason I think this is so stupid, a lot of British media apparently focused on a horrifically violent scene where Jennifer is tortured using a rat tied to a stick. I've put a link here in the outline. Anybody else is going to have to go look it up themselves because it's, you can just look up Rule of Rose rat. Here's the scene in question. See if you can tell why I think it's stupid that this was the center of a moral panic.
So I'm watching it now. It's uncomfortable to watch, sure, but yeah, I mean the models are a little rough, and yeah, we've certainly come a long way since then, especially some of the weird facial animations. But yeah, the quote of horrifically violent is well overblown.
The rat doesn't even attack her at all.
No, yeah, it's like just being pushed uncomfortably against her face.
And then she faints for some reason. That's the whole scene.
Honestly, the most offensive part is like the bad dubbing of like the chanting of Amanda, Amanda. It's just, yeah, it's uncomfortable, but that's horror games, baby.
Are you saying you would not describe this scene as horrifically violent?
I'm not a think of the children kind of person, so no, I would not describe it falsely as such.
So yeah, that was the center of the moral panic about Rule of Rose, was this stupid scene with a rat that's near the beginning of the game and is really weird, but it's nothing. There's nothing there. There's nothing. At least when Fox News talked about Mass Effect, there was, in fact, sex implied to be happening.
Yeah, there was partial nudity.
Like, at least then. But anyways, Rule of Rose is kind of a cult classic now, and you can tell that because while it is generally looked back on with interest, it did not review very well. Most outlets gave it somewhere between a 4 to 6 out of 10. And they gave a lot of praise to the game's plot, the art direction, the overall atmosphere, as well as its respectful handling of subjects like childhood trauma. But it was heavily criticized for its awful combat, large amounts of backtracking, pretty clunky controls, an infuriating camera that the camera in this game is so bad. It seems like they wanted to have both a camera that you could put in front and behind you at any time, but also have fixed camera angles. And you can't have both of those things. And it's also a huge reminder why games with fixed camera angles usually have tank controls, because Rule of Rose doesn't, and it jerks to different camera angles without warning. And it doesn't adapt your inputs to that. So I had multiple times where I would walk around a corner, the camera would change, but I'd be holding forward, and the new camera angle was in front of Jennifer, so she'd turn around and go back where she came from.
Oh,
playing this game is bad. It was also criticized for the fact that Jennifer just doesn't really seem to have a personality outside of passively taking whatever abuse is hurled at her for a majority of the game. She did, however, get a little bit of praise for not being overly sexualized like many female characters in the genre / in video games up to that point. Which the bar, even back then, was subterranean, so I guess, hey, cool. A quote from the review in the magazine Play, which I found interesting, a good description of my experience with the game as well, says, quote, "I think everyone should experience this game, especially horror fans, but in order to do so, you're gonna have to suffer through times of sheer agony, just like poor, unlucky Jennifer. And it's not worth it. Just go look up a long play." The IP rights to Rule of Rose currently belong to Onion Games, who we talked about back in episode 172 for their Dandy Dungeon game. And they have voiced interest in a remaster, though there is no indication that anything of the sort is actually on the horizon at this time, and Onion Games themselves has warned that any such desire might not have more than a 1% chance of actually being realized. Their exact words, by the way. Though their 2018 game Blackbird apparently contains several references to Rule of Rose, so the game is not forgotten. Again, it is looked back on with interest, but I don't understand people who say that it's like worth it to muscle through the terrible gameplay to get to the plot. I could not disagree more.
I mean, granted, we are in a time of horror game remasters and remakes and things like that, so who knows?
Who knows? So the composer for Rule of Rose is a man by the name of Yutaka Minobe, who I believe has come up on this show in passing a couple of times. He was born on October 7th, 1972 in Yokohama, Japan. Self-taught musician. He learned piano by the age of 4 and was apparently composing original music by the age of 8. And he began working for Sega Sound Team in 1996, where he started composing for them in 1998, largely for Sonic games. And then he left Sega in 2005 to join Delphi Sound, which is a subsidiary of Marvelous Entertainment, who makes the Story of Seasons games. However, this has not stopped him from being able to work with other companies, including continuing to work on some Sonic titles for Sega to this day. And boy, he has done a lot of games. He is credited as the composer on Skies of Arcadia, Sonic Advance, Shinobi, Panzer Dragoon Orta, Sonic Advance 2, Skies of Arcadia Legends, Sonic Pinball Party, Onimusha Blade Warriors, Sonic Heroes, Rule of Rose, Yoshi's Island DS, Knight's Journey of Dreams, Sonic and the Black Knight, Little King's Story, Fling Smash, Sonic Generations, 3 games in the Mario and Sonic Olympics series being London 2012, Winter Sochi 2014, and Rio 2016, Story of Seasons Trio of Towns, Doraemon Story of Seasons, Space Channel 5 VR, and Doraemon Story of Seasons Friends of the Great Kingdom. And he also does a lot of performances for a lot of games, mainly piano. He's credited as a performance on Sonic Adventure, Space Channel 5 Part 2, Sonic Unleashed, and Nier. And that's not all of the games on his discography, by the way. It's just the names I recognized. It was a lot longer than this. He's also apparently done a lot of music for Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, specifically 5Ds, GX, Zexal, and the movies Bonds Beyond Time and The Dark Side of Dimensions. So there's that, too? Is that the first time Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been mentioned on this show?
That's a very good question, but it might be.
In terms of Rule of Rose specifically, though, the entire score is actually recorded with studio musicians, and it's performed by the Tokyo Chamber Music Society Orchestra. The game's main theme is performed by the Hiroshi Murayama Trio, which appears to be a jazz trio out of Japan, based on what I was looking into. And it also includes performances by Minobe himself, which, obviously, if you already have a really good piano player in the form of yourself, why hire a piano player? Minobe says the music was meant to bring a, quote, human element to the game's atmosphere. And honestly, I'm going to be real, I don't think I've ever heard another horror game that sounds like this game. If you are thinking of what survival horror games usually sound like, I guarantee this game doesn't sound like that. So let's go ahead and jump into the Critical 5 to sort of showcase what I mean by that. And we're going to start with critical track number 1. This is A Love Suicide, the theme of Rule of Rose.
I will do you harm, I will break my arm, I'm a victim of your charms. I want to be dead when I'm in bed. I can be so mean, you can beat me. I would like to shame you, I would like to blame you.
So, as the title might suggest, this is the main theme of Rule of Rose. It is performed by the Hiroshi Murayama Trio, Lyrics were written by Kan Hashimoto, and the vocals are by Kaori Kondo, who is Hiroshi Murayama's wife. This is also kind of different from pretty much all the other stuff on the soundtrack. There's a second version of this song on the soundtrack that is like EQ'd to sound like it's coming off of a record player, like a really old record player. But obviously, this is the clear version. If I'm going to showcase this song, might as well use that. And I don't know, it's a pretty good song. What does it remind me of? It reminds me of another game that has a song very similar to am I thinking of L.A. Noire, maybe?
Oh, maybe. The first vibe I got was almost Can't Say Goodbye to Yesterday from Metal Gear Solid 2.
Yeah, I was thinking of that too. But I don't think that was the song I was thinking of. But it is very close to Can't Say Goodbye to Yesterday, 100%. It being this nice lounge song, the vocalist is pretty good, though it's got that problem of this is a Japanese vocalist singing English lyrics that we run into a lot. But I think overall she's doing a very good job in pronunciation. I assume she probably speaks English, maybe, at least a little bit. But I don't know that for sure. But yeah, this is a nice somber theme, and that somber feeling is going to carry along to the other tracks. It's just, they don't really sound like this.
I think you're right. She does push through well, but the accent is pretty apparent. But it is a nice feeling of that piece. And you're right. If it's going to remind us of these different slow, lounge, jazzy type of vocal songs, yeah, that's a pretty good thing to channel, and should set up interestingly for the rest of the soundtrack. I'm curious to hear what the rest of the music sounds like if this is the starting point.
Well, let's get into that with critical track number 2. This is Backbiting. This is a bit more upbeat compared to a lot of the stuff on the soundtrack, but a lot of the soundtrack is basically the strings. This soundtrack has a huge emphasis on violin and cello specifically, and it's great. This is one of the more popular songs in the game as far as I could tell. I don't know where it plays. I think it might just play when you're exploring parts of the airship, I assume, because this seems like an exploratory song, but I don't remember. And I just kind of like the vibe to it, despite the fact that it doesn't super fit the general tone of Rule of Rose, but I do like the idea that it's sort of this little window of almost optimism sort of peeking through this terrible, terrible airship. Unfortunately, it also led to an experience of me again feeling old, because the kids are at it again. Peter, all of the YouTube comments on this video are pointing out that this is apparently used as the cafe theme in a popular Roblox game called Blox Fruits.
Oh, no.
And that's all of the comments, by the way.
Roblox now on PlayStation, or coming soon. Oh, man. Yeah, whenever Roblox comes up and like the controversies with it and the sound effects and all that, just... yeah, feel super, super old. There was some game several months ago where we brought up a similar sort of thing where it's like, oh yeah, I guess it gets used by people just kind of lifting the song and using it inappropriately. But this is a fun little piece. It's got a little bit of playfulness, and you're right, like a little window into maybe opulence on the airship. The chamber orchestra is a nice vibe, and after playing it recently, it's making me think of the chamber orchestra Austin Wintory used for Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Again, another England set game, but really interesting and a different vibe and genre altogether. I like this. This is fun.
But anyways, it's time to get into the horror, though. And the appropriately named critical track number 3 will help us get there. This is Fear 2. Should be noted, the official title of this track on the official soundtrack release is apparently Ambient Music for Strings, Fear, Part 2. I'm just going to go ahead and call it Fear 2 because that's what everybody calls it. But, yep, here's the horror. This is it's a panicked song. It's very skittery almost, like small feet sort of walking around, and that fits since pretty much all the enemies are just small, like, zombie children things, like husk children. It's odd, but I don't know. I really, really like this song. Survival horror usually has a thing where, like, oh, when it wants you to be scared, it's this Yamaoka-esque cacophony of just noise, and this does not go that direction, and instead, I could hear this being in, like, a stage ballet or something. It just has that feeling to it. I really dig this song.
Yeah, I can see why you've brought this as a different kind of texture and sound to a horror game during this spooky season here. Just a lot of the plucking strings, and you're right, the dissonance, creating that little footstep feeling. It gives the right energy level, the right tempo, but also just the right tension to go with what I'm sure is going on the screen. But also, yeah, very different compared to most horror game soundtracks. And it's interesting to listen to, but also a little unsettling. And I like that blend.
And let's get to more of what Rule of Rose typically sounds like. With critical track number 4, this is The Attic. This is what a majority of the soundtrack sounds like when it's not stuff like Fear. This somber string piece with this very melancholy feel to it. Again, I can't think of another horror game that sounds like this. And I think that's awesome. And it's what really grabbed me when I was going through and listening to the soundtrack. Just the difference. And I think this is one of the songs that really, really, really shows off that difference.
Also, just the choice of the instruments that are chosen here for its simplicity and use in the chamber orchestra. The piano coming and sprinkling in gives it that nice, perfect touch.
Probably Minobe as well.
Yeah, come to think about it, that's a really, really good point. But everything is just lightly done here. And yeah, wow. That's really nice to listen to. And yeah, for a horror game, I would not have thought that, but it's good to have different examples like this brought up.
Like when your peers are Silent Hill.
Right. Like, especially during the era where you're, 5 years coming off of Silent Hill 2 when Yamaoka's classic revolutionary score, and you kind of just go in the opposite direction a little bit.
Yeah, it's refreshing, honestly. I wish the game was good. Let's get into critical track number 5. This is actually my favorite song on the soundtrack. This is Promise. Speaking of Silent Hill 2, there's also a song called Promise in that game, and that's what jumped out to me first.
Oh, that's true.
But this could not be further away from that. That's a rock song, and this is very much not that. It sounds like a duet between a violin and a cello.
If not a violin, a viola, but yeah, just two instruments at play here.
And it sounds so good. It is so nice to listen to, despite the fact that it is depressing. And kind of fits the whole theme of like, oh, this is just what Jennifer's going through, I guess. This is the tone of everything. And again, just, I think another horror game needs to come out with a, like, chamber orchestra soundtrack like this. I think it would be great, especially today.
Yeah, I don't want it locked away to, like, games set in England or with, like, English inspiration. I feel like it could work in a variety of settings, and it's just nice to hear and sets a really delicate touch.
So for tracks on the cutting room floor, I got one that is closer to what we've been listening to, and then I have one that again leans more into the scary horror vibes. And the first one is Bullying. I don't quite know why this song is called Bullying. It has a very dramatic start, at the very least, and a kind of a dramatic feel throughout, but not as much as the intro. I mean, if any game's going to have a track called Bullying, it should probably be this one. And I do really, really like this song. This is probably the closest to almost making it on the Critical 5, to be honest.
That's fair. It's got a similar sound to Promise, for sure. I would have expected with a track titled Bullying to have it be a little punchier. Maybe you're playing during a scene where, maybe during that rat torture scene where Jennifer is being bullied, maybe, I don't know. But for this seemingly being like the end of the soundtrack, there must also be some importance to it. It still sounds good. I mean, keeping up the simplicity, but just with a different twinge to it.
And now let's get to the scary stuff. This is Fear 1. Now this sounds a little bit closer to like, this sounds like a horror movie? Like maybe like a slasher film? Maybe? I don't know, from like the early 90s or something. That's what comes to mind first, at least for me. It sounds a little bit closer to what you'd expect from horror. That being said, the intro, and I can't unhear this, sounds like you've gotten into a random encounter in an RPG.
Oh, sure. And like if you're getting into these battles, like you got to have probably something like that. Also, the kind of bass or the boom, doom, doom, the little plucking of the low string there is kind of doing a good job of setting something like a tempo for a battle, right? But yeah, the strings are just also doing these fun things like the whining, the meow, kind of falling effects that like that.
A lot of tremolo in there too.
Sure, and like just doing a lot of things that I think, yeah, this feels more up like what you'd expect from a horror soundtrack. But again, it's the instrumentation and it's minimalism that's kind of getting you, and it works pretty effectively.
So what will I never forget about Rule of Rose? Combat's just so bad. It's so bad. I have never, like, it wasn't even a rage quit. It was I had like the least amount of fun I've ever had fighting a boss just then. I'm not even going to give it a second try. Like, that's how bad it was. maybe some people will disagree with me. I'm sure there are plenty of people who disagree with me. The combat in Rule of Rose is terrible.
Did you at least watch like a long play, whatever, to kind of round out the story, or did you know what happened generally?
No, I hadn't watched a long play yet. I had hoped to before. Like this, me quitting Rule of Rose was like 2 nights ago.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. But I meant to watch a long play and never really got a chance. I don't know. The plot, at least as far as I saw, is really weird. Like, really, really weird. And the bits and pieces I saw in the synopsis on Wikipedia sound like it goes some wild places. So, honestly, I do want to watch a long play. But just, I don't know, man. Playing this game just does not feel worth it. It is not fun. It's not fun. But the soundtrack, though, is like, especially for a PS2 game in 2006, pretty damn good.
Oh, yeah, I don't think I would ever play it, but it really does interest me to know that there is a horror game from this era that sounds like this. And I wasn't expecting chamber orchestra doing these lightly structured horror clips or just, the somber beauty to it. But it works. It works super well.
I just realized that this game and next week's game for me are both games that I don't like.
It has a wrinkle to it, that's for sure.
Oops. Didn't do that on purpose. Anyways, for the transition, we usually like to pick a fan cover, fan remix, just to sort of highlight it and take us into the next part. I am very surprised that there were several covers of A Love Suicide online. Nothing else. I think there was somebody who did like a piano rendition of Promise, but like obviously the stars of the show were the multiple Love Suicide covers that I found. And one that I particularly liked was by YouTuber Feralady. This is Feralady. Ferality.
Feraligator.
Yeah, that one. I'm so sorry if you somehow end up listening to this at any point. But yeah, she does a really, really good job. And her vocals have a different sort of flavor from the original, I think. And I think it fits super well. So please enjoy that, and we will be right back.
I want to be dead when I lament. I can be so mean, you can beat me. I would like to shame you, I would like to blame you, just because.
What a change between the simple chamber orchestra found in Rule of Rose to one of the first games launched on the Super Nintendo. Let's change tones entirely and talk about Super Mario World. We have talked about Mario plenty on this show before, but outside of the different RPG, sports, other kinds of Mario spin-offs, it's been a while since we've talked about a Mario platformer. Talked about Super Mario 64 on episode 17, Super Mario 3D World on episode 22, followed it right up with Super Mario Land on episode 23, then Super Mario Odyssey on episode 80, and Super Mario Galaxy on episode 86.
So not only has this been like the first time we're talking about a Mario game in a while, it's only the second 2D Mario game we have ever talked about on this show.
And when it gets to talking about, we got Koji Kondo pretty early on with Super Mario 64, but it's tough to find a connection outside of that. Well, able to make it work somehow today for Super Mario World here on episode 247. And Super Mario World, Super Mario Bros. 4, released November 21st, 1990 in Japan for Super Famicom. It launched as Super Mario World in North America on August 23rd, 1991 for Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and then in Europe on April 11th, 1992. So across 3 years technically for the big regions. Australia would get it a few months later on July 1st, 1992. It is the launch game for Super Nintendo. I guess in Japan it was just Super Mario World and F-Zero to start out. Quite a good pair of games there, and we'll talk about F-Zero by the end of the year. So there you go. The game was re-released in a special version of Super Mario All-Stars. That is Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World, and that was a pack-in game for Super Nintendo in December 1994. Of course, Super Mario All-Stars being the ports of the first 3 Super Mario Brothers games to have that 16-bit graphic look. Then Super Mario World was ported to the Game Boy Advance as Super Mario World Super Mario Advance 2, which released in Japan in December 2001, and then the rest of the world in early 2002. Super Mario World, of course, is an easy inclusion among Nintendo's virtual console services throughout the years. Also, the SNES Classic Novelty Console release. And of course, it was a launch title for the Nintendo Switch Online service for that library of Super Nintendo games. So if you want to play Super Mario World today, probably the easiest place to do so there. Of course, the game is developed by Nintendo EAD and published by Nintendo. Super Mario World is a 2D side-scrolling platform game in which the player controls Mario or Luigi, the protagonists of the game. The game, of course, has similar gameplay to earlier games in the Super Mario series. Of course, Super Mario Brothers. Again, how have we not talked about that game on the show? It's the Koji Kondo. It's finding that in. We'll get there one day, I'm sure.
To be fair, does that game even have 5 songs?
That's the real question, if we're being honest. And then there's, of course, Super Mario Brothers 2, whether that's, the Japanese one or the Doki Doki Panic-inspired US one, and of course then Super Mario Brothers 3. But Super Mario Brothers 4, Super Mario World, introduces new elements. As well as dashing and jumping, the player can also fly or float with the aid of the Cape Feather and P-Balloon. And the player can also execute the new Spin Jump move to break blocks and things like that. It's that little tornado jump. The game also introduces Yoshi, a dinosaur companion that Mario can ride, who is able to eat most enemies, and he can spit some of them back out. Also, I guess you could jump off Yoshi if you need that extra little bit of boost, but also could cause Yoshi's demise. The game has 96 level exits in total, because it's all about the secret paths, especially near the end of the game, and finding the keys, and gives you different paths around the world map, etc., etc.
I hate the exit system, personally.
Oh, good. Me too. We'll get to talk about that.
Well, I hate it in one specific spot where it's the only part of the game where it's mandatory that you find a different exit, which is the Forest of Illusion. I don't like that. But
So, the story of Super Mario World. Well, I guess it tells you more in the instruction manual than, the bit that they introduce at the beginning of the game. Because, it's a Super Nintendo game. There's only so much narrative that you need to present, especially in a Mario game. So, quote, after bringing peace to the Mushroom World in Super Mario Bros. 3, the brothers Mario and Luigi decide to go on vacation with Princess Toadstool to a place called Dinosaur Land. a prehistoric-themed world swarming with dinosaurs and other enemies. While resting on the beach, Princess Toadstool is captured by Bowser. When Mario and Luigi wake up, they try to find her, and after hours of searching, come across a giant egg in the forest. It suddenly hatches, and out of it comes a young dinosaur named Yoshi, which, sidebar, isn't his full name they talked about recently, I don't know, a few years ago. It was T. Yoshi Sor Munchakoopas or something like that. I don't know, but something weird like that. Anyway, Yoshi tells them that his dinosaur friends have also been imprisoned in eggs by Bowser's kids, the evil Koopalings. Again, they're not his kids, but I guess at the time, maybe they might have been, who knows. Mario and Luigi soon realize that Bowser's forces must have captured Toadstool as well. Big questions here. Can Mario and Luigi save Princess Toadstool and the Yoshis? I know, the most gripping of plots. But, Joe, here's where I'll ask you, what are our experiences with Super Mario World?
Super Mario World is one of the games that my uncle had for his Super Nintendo, though it was not played nearly as much as the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. I had never beaten Super Mario World until we did it for Smash Pieces. I had played it a good amount, but I'd never gotten to the end. So that was a cool thing to happen. I'd never fought the final boss, which I guess up to that point, that kind of seems like maybe one of the more unique boss fights that Mario had up to that point in general. So that was cool as well. I don't know. It's iconic for a reason. It's a really, really good game. It's probably still maybe the best 2D Mario game, to this day. Granted, it, after its direct sequel, 2D Mario kind of went away for years. But yeah, I think that it's, I have never played Mario Brothers 3, but as far as I'm aware, it is between 3 and World for the best 2D Mario game. And I side with World personally.
Yeah, I can see that. I feel like it's one of those classic Mario games, held up as the best as it gets for 2D Mario for sure. And yet, I think I only played it for the first time ever last year. And I haven't beaten it because I got a little frustrated at some of those exits. Granted, it's nice to have it be a time in the internet age when you can look those things up. And it must have been, conversations on the playground and all things like that. Things that help lengthen the time of playing the game. But I really enjoyed what I played. Obviously, it's a classic Mario platformer. Again, I come from an experience of not having much 2D game experience, especially with 2D platformers. So my skills are not anywhere near those who grew up with these games. But obviously, it's a classic for a reason, and I enjoyed what I played. But yeah, I probably got to World 5. I got pretty far, so I should pick it back up. And it was nice to play on Nintendo Switch Online with the Super Nintendo controller there. So that gave a little sense of authenticity, and I liked that. I didn't find as much development info on Super Mario World as I expected, but then again, it is Nintendo, and they're kind of a keeper of their own secrets, only talking about really what they have to. So I found a couple interesting things. So because it was a hardware transition from NES to SNES, there was going to be the original thought, or at least an experiment of what the team could do for this console. So they started with the idea of porting Super Mario Brothers 3 to SNES. And for the team, it felt like the same game to them, despite the improved colors and sprites. So after that, Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto, who for this game, he was a producer. Takashi Tezuka ended up with the role of director, but they would kind of say that Miyamoto still kind of threw his weight around when it came to decisions and all that. He still had the power when it came to making the game. He said that the team's goal would be to use the hardware to create something totally new. Yeah, that sure sounds like Miyamoto. He said that he wanted Mario to have a dinosaur companion ever since Super Mario Bros. But Nintendo engineers could not add such a character into the game due to the limitations of the NES. The inspiration for Yoshi can even be traced back further, as Miyamoto designed a green dragon for the 1984 game Devil World, which actually ended up sharing many similarities with Yoshi. There was also a concept image of Mario riding a horse in the planning for Super Mario Bros. 3, but when character designer Shigefumi Hino created a dinosaur character for use in World, it was at first too reptilian, and Miyamoto said it, quote, didn't really fit into the Mario world. So they made him more cartoony, and there you go, boom, Yoshi. And this game launched at a time when Nintendo's dominance in the console market had slipped to Sega because of the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog. It was like, oh, for the first time since the end of 1985, Nintendo wasn't top dog, and so kind of created the idea of the console wars as Mario kind of regained that popularity. Super Mario World reviewed exceptionally well, with a game rankings average of 94%, which for game reviews at the time, that's remarkable. It's really good. The visuals, the presentation, the level design, the platforming precision, the replay value, and the audio were all points of praise. Couldn't really find any critiques. I think, honestly, the only thing I've ever heard about Super Mario World is, the different, warp points, the different hidden exits are a little tough to find. I guess that's the point, but still, it's a game that you hear glowing praise for. And it went on to sell more than 20 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling Super Nintendo game. The game received 1991 Game of the Year awards from Nintendo Power and Power Play. It's not a time when we had BAFTAs, DICE Awards, Game Awards, anything like that, so you get awards from different outlets. But it is often considered one of the best games in the series, and it is cited as one of the greatest video games ever made. In its final issue in October 2014, Official Nintendo Magazine ranked Super Mario World the third greatest Nintendo game of all time, behind The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time and Super Mario Galaxy. In 2012, Nintendo Power similarly named Super Mario World the fifth greatest game of all time, which was a step up from its eighth best ranking in their 2006 poll. The legacy of Super Mario World? Well, there was an animated show called Super Mario World with 13 episodes that ran on NBC from September to December 1991. But Yoshi has been an enduring character in the franchise, and he even appeared as the main playable character in the game's 1995 prequel, Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, which would then help lead to multiple video games focusing on Yoshi as the protagonist. Super Mario World also has a long-standing ROM hacking scene, with games like Kaizo Mario World, which was probably one of the many reasons that it likely precipitated Nintendo to make 2015's Super Mario Maker, a design-your-own Mario game where Super Mario World was one of the styles for the Mario platforming. And also, Shigeru Miyamoto has gone on record to say, as of 2016, that Super Mario World is his favorite Mario game. Though I guess at the time, he said that it felt like they had to kind of rush it to meet the launch of Super Nintendo, so it kind of felt unfinished to him, but still, for it to say that it's his favorite. And why are we talking about Super Mario World? Well, it's because Super Mario Bros. Wonder launches this Friday, October 20th, for Nintendo Switch. The first new original 2D Super Mario Brothers game in quite a long time. Was Wii U the last one?
I think so, because then it got re-released on Switch. Yeah, I think New Super Mario Bros. U was the last 2D Mario game to come out.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds about right. So it's been a long time. It looks really creative and clever and fun, and it might even have like a game of the year, at least a nomination buzz going about it. So I hope that does well. But I'm sorry, I'll be playing Spider-Man 2. I'm trying to get Assassin's Creed out of the way for October 20th is Spider-Man 2 day for me. I'm sorry. So if we can't talk about Koji Kondo for the music of Super Mario World, how do we make this work? Let's talk about Soichi Noriki. And Soichi Noriki was born on October 20th, 1957, in Kyoto, Japan. He is a Japanese jazz musician. As a keyboardist and pianist, he's also a composer and arranger. He studied classical piano from a young age and then listened to Miles Davis and John Coltrane and became obsessed with jazz. He joined his father's full band in 1974, and in 1977 he moved to Tokyo and had many sessions with the George Kawaguchi Band and others. He formed his own band, Noriki, in 1983 and released his own music. He's also been part of groups like East Bounce, Urban Nitrops, and What Is Hip? What is
hip?
We're talking about Soichi Noriki today because Super Mario World came out with an official soundtrack release, weirdly enough, in like 1991, I think. And the first disc of the album release was a jazz arrange album with songs from Super Mario World arranged by Soichi Noriki. He also played the keyboards on it. You may have heard it as like YouTubers use different remixes from it. Here's an example of one of the tracks. So yeah, that's why we're bringing in Soichi Noriki today, because then like disc 2 is just the soundtrack for Super Mario World. Does that mean it gets put on streaming services? Of course not. But, you know, we can't have everything. Of course, then on his own, Soichi Noriki released albums as early as 1983 and 1984 with Noriki, and then as recently as 2018 and 2019, where he's got like a piano solo album and things like that. Still doing music on his own. So for the music for Super Mario World, of course, it is composed by Koji Kondo, who we talked about in episode 17 of the show. And as Super Mario World was the first game ever developed for Super Nintendo, Kondo felt overjoyed at being able to compose music by using 8 sounds at once. It's a big deal from what, the 3 to 4 on NES? So
I think it was 3 on NES.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you got like another one in a sound chip, but like still a big step up. And to express the technological novelty of the new console, he used several different instruments, implementing them all one after the other in the game's title song, which, yes, we will hear shortly. As development progressed, Kondo grew concerned, though, over how people would react to his unusual combinations of instruments, as he noted the use of more traditional square waves and triangle waves had gained acceptance with consumers. Yeah, it gained acceptance because that's what people were used to, but when you present better instrument sounds on Super Nintendo, look at that. Kondo's soundtrack was a revelation, I think, at the time. And of course, Super Nintendo would only go on to be like, oh, Nobuo Uematsu puts together an opera for Final Fantasy VI. That would only be a few years later. So amazing what could be done with the technology. But starting out, Super Mario World, quite the soundtrack for just leveling up over NES. For the game's sound effects, Kondo decided to use a variety of musical instruments as opposed to square waves, to emphasize that the game used traditional technology with a hybrid of new materials. It took Kondo around a year and a half to write all of the music for the game. And this soundtrack even does something pretty neat, because when you ride Yoshi around, the big, new feature for the gameplay, Yoshi adds another instrument layer to the music. So especially in like the main overworld theme, if you jump on Yoshi, you get a little bongo instrument layer added in there. We're not going to necessarily go back and forth and highlight between the two, but an early example for the technology at the time where that's dynamic music, baby. Like the music changing just slightly and adding a new layer and wrinkle to it as you get on and off, this dinosaur to ride throughout the world. So a lot of classics when you talk about picking a critical 5 for Super Mario World. I mean, our first Mario 2D platformer in a long time. So let's get to it. Let's hit some of the big ones. And of course, we have to start with critical track number 1 for Super Mario World. It is opening title. Now, with that in mind, it is pretty neat to hear on how, the piece starts pretty simplistically and, maybe it's not so different, but then you start to hear more of the layers and different instruments added in to kind of show the complexity with the new hardware. And I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, a classic theme to be sure. And, we're going to have many more of those where that came from, but just a nice, simple little start before you, hit the start button and go to the overworld map where, new music comes in for that. But what it must have been for Mario players at the time to, maybe they were used to playing on NES, and then you get this new Super Mario Brothers 4 Mario World game on a new console. And, the music possibilities must have seemed such a big leap from there. But yeah, looking back on it now, it just has a feel of classic nostalgia, I suppose. But you just got to think with the reference of what it must have been at the time.
Yeah, I never thought about that being the reason why it starts out really simple and then gets a little bit more complex as it goes. But it's not the most iconic song from this game, but it is definitely a very close second, I think.
Well, if you want to talk about the most, you might as well get that main overworld theme. Critical track number 2 for Super Mario World is aptly titled Overworld. I mean, of course, had to be here. It's the staple track for the game for sure. Nice to hear you're talking about the instrument possibilities. Little steel drums on the main melody. It's just such a nice texture. And, if you're at this dinosaur land, prehistoric land, you kind of have a lot of these seem to be percussion based, which is kind of neat. But there's still just a lot of happy, fun melody here. A classic for Mario, if there was ever a classic, and this is one of them. It's not overworld Super Mario Brothers original level, but for representing a new generation, so to speak, yeah, this is the one.
This is the song I think has like the added percussion for Yoshi the clearest.
Yeah, I would say it's most prominent with the dynamic track there, yeah.
And I think that is super cool. I just really like the Yoshi stuff. I never noticed it until it was pointed out to me like a few years ago. Maybe more than a few, but like I had to have it pointed out to me because I just never realized. And yeah, this is one of the most iconic like overworld themes for a platformer ever. Like you said, it's not the Super Mario Brothers theme. Like non-video game folks aren't going to know this song. But if you play video games and you've ever interacted with a Nintendo game, there's a good chance you know this song.
For sure. And it also establishes the leitmotif that'll be used throughout the game. We'll even hear different tracks that try to play with it in different ways. The da-da-da-da-da-da kind of melody line. Even there's a track called Athletic, which gets used in some other, mix-up levels. But, okay, it's the same song, just a different arrangement. It's faster. So, yeah, it's a good example of that. So Athletic, again, another classic one, but it's like, it's just the same song, but sounds a little different and faster. So there's that. You want to get into some darker texture layered, when it gets to the end of the worlds, you got to go to the castle theme. And so this sure is a classic castle theme for a Mario game, I think. So critical track number 3 for Super Mario World. This is Sub Castle. See, there you go. There's that leitmotif coming back, but in a darker, more minor key. You have some of the fluttering going on in the background. The big percussion comes in, the big organ-like chords. And man, the runs that this little, or I guess it's still the organ, but the musical runs that this is going on, there's quite a bit going on here, especially for the time. And I've always loved this castle theme. Mario games generally have pretty good castle themes, if we're being honest, but this is a classic. And to kind of go a little more into the piece to pull this clip, it's a good example of, I think, all the tools being thrown at it for the early days of Super Nintendo.
Obviously, I think this is like the best castle theme in the series, like 100%. Of all the 2D Mario games. I'm sure somebody's going to come in here and be like, Mario 3. I don't actually remember what Mario 3's castle theme sounds like. I know the airship theme, but that's as far as it goes. I really like this track. It is one of my favorite tracks on the entire soundtrack. I think the athletic version of Overworld takes it as number 1, but I do actually think that the castle theme is probably my favorite.
Had to go back for a refresher, so I'll hum it out. The Mario 3 castle theme is ba 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 da 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 ba.
Great.
Ba ba ba. And so it's like, oh, yeah, okay, all right. But this stomps the crap out of it, like the meme goes, when you're stomping turdies. That's what this castle theme does to Mario 3's. Number 4 on the Critical 5. Brings up the memories for you, Joe, of playing, because it is one of those classic bosses for the era. Number 4 on the Critical 5 here. This is the evil King Koopa, Bowser. So as Bowser comes in looking goofy, his little clown ship, the piece does a really nice job in kind of bringing that foreboding in before a really frantic background. Good vibes for a final boss for this game. After you've been dealing with all of his crappy little kids, the Koopalings, bringing that theme tied back to Rule of Rose. This is a pretty classic boss, I think, looking back on it. I don't know if it's, I think maybe Mario World 2 Yoshi Island does a better final boss as far as the foreboding nature goes. But for this one, to start off SNES and the piece that goes with it, yeah, this one had to be here.
Yeah. I only ever remember the intro. Not that the rest of the song is much different from the intro, but the intro, I think, is where this song really shines, which you hear that in the clip. And, I don't know, this boss is fine. The boss itself. Again, it's certainly unique compared to a lot of other boss fights that Mario had up to that point, but I think I agree Yoshi's Island has a much better final boss, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of music. I think it kicks the crap out of this one.
Yeah, Mode 7 makes a difference, I'm sure, with the scaling of the sprites and all that. But technology they'd figure out later. So, of course, if there was one Mario theme from Super Mario World that we're missing, of course we'd have to cover it here at the end to round out the Critical 5. And this is, of course, ending and credits. Still ranks up there as one of the best ending themes of all time in games. When people point out, like, what's the classic ending theme? More often than not, they're thinking of this song, and it's for good reason. It starts out simple and happy and fun, but then kind of builds up to the attempted, full big band orchestration for what is possible on the sound chip at the time. And yeah, it certainly works to provide that finality. Kind of always thinking about that Brental Floss cover of "You Beat the Game, You're Feeling Pretty Cool." And I don't know, that's just old internet culture coming back to me, but I feel like this is the one. Even though we've talked about great classic ending credits themes in games, when you talk about the old times, this is one of the best, for sure.
I do really like this one, though it's not my favorite Mario credits theme. That goes to 64 still, I think.
Sure, definitely.
To this day. But it is incredibly iconic and catchy. Oh, it's so catchy. It's so catchy. I kind of hate how catchy it is.
Right?
And by hate, I mean I love that it's catchy, but...
It's so good.
It's so good. It is so good. The Smash remix, I think, does a really good job at it. I don't remember what it's paired with, if it's paired with anything. I'm not sure. But there is a remix of it in Smash, and it is very good. Which would have been the first place that I ever heard it. But it's, it is well worth being called iconic in general. And especially for that era, definitely the most iconic credits theme.
Oh, yeah. Just had to be here to wrap things up. And I think it does a good job of that. There's not much overall on the soundtrack, though. Once you start whittling away, this theme that uses the overworld theme very one-to-one and just in a slightly different way. So, Joe, you would normally have cutting room floor tracks for this game, but I guess, not today because, there's just not much to choose from. So I'll take two, and I've got a couple interesting options here. The first one here is Map 1, Yoshi's Island. It's a simple 10-second loop, but you know what? It is super effective, and I think it's right up there with the title screen for it to transition right into this. I think it just continues with, the iconic sound for an iconic game, and as you learn of the plight of the Yoshis, you kind of got to start with that first world and then going right into that overworld theme. It's just part of the simple opening experience, I think, for the game. And good point to have it here on the cutting room floor.
It is the second most iconic main map song on the Super Nintendo. And I'll die on that hill because the most iconic is Simian Segway from Donkey Kong Country.
Sure. I'll give you that ranking. Yep.
As much as Donkey Kong Country is a game that is middling at best, like its soundtrack is fantastic, and that is like the best map theme on the Super Nintendo. But this is definitely a very, very close second. And when I think of map themes from Super Mario World, this is absolutely the one that comes up in my head. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's the only one that I can think of off the top of my head. Like the only one I could whistle without listening to it. So that says something, I think.
I think the second one is like boom,
Oh, never mind. I do. Yeah, I do know that one.
So there's that one, but like out of the several, like it's the early ones that stick the most as far as like what's in your memory. So anyway, for another cutting room floor track, I mean, there's got to be some inclusion for spooky season, right? I mean, Super Mario World, not a spooky game, but I don't know. Some of these levels sure could be considered that. Cutting room floor track number 2 for me. This is Ghost House. As you gotta move around boos who will only move and pursue you with their little ghostly forms when you're not looking at them, so you turn around and make them all shy and bashful. A good example of spooky music on this instrument palette and set. Again, the the overworld leitmotif getting repurposed for a spooky setting, fitting for the season. Had to be here. There's underwater, there's underground that also uses the leitmotif, but I feel like this one does the most with it outside of the other dark vibes of the castle theme.
I love this song. I especially love the sliding, I guess it's supposed to be strings.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That gives it a super creepy feeling, or as creepy as Mario World is going to get. It is not my favorite Boo theme, but it is definitely up there, and it's definitely earned a spot as being incredibly iconic and fun. I really like the Ghost House theme in Mario World. It's very good.
So what will I never forget about Super Mario World? I feel like for the limited time that I played it, especially recently, not growing up with it in my youth, still a lot of the themes from this game are classics. And, for us to finally find the end to bring this to the show, almost 5 years into our existence. Oh my gosh. For us to finally talk about Super Mario World. Yeah, it's a long time coming, especially with these classic, iconic themes. But you know what? Good to finally do so because, man, so many good Mario themes here and just good video game music. Just remembering the limitations of the era, the start of the Super Nintendo, and what would go on from there for the console, to be honest. But to start out with this, It's just fantastic.
It is a fantastic game. The Forest of Illusion sucks, and I will die on that hill, and people can come at me all they want. That being the only spot in the game, as far as I remember, where finding an alternate exit is mandatory, sucks. I think the exits being there is cool, and I like that for like players that want to go find that. Fine. It shouldn't be mandatory at any point in the game.
Pretty sure thinking back on it, like that's where I kind of hit a frustration point with it. So I honestly should push through it, especially when you can pause and go back on Nintendo Switch Online. There's no excuse.
Yeah.
Even for noobs like me.
Like, the entire game is fantastic. But just that one aspect, I think, is the part where I'm like, yeah, I don't like that part. And people tell me I'm crazy, and I don't care.
It really makes a difference when you grow up with it versus not. All right. All these terrible children. Les Enfants Terribles comes up next week. But, oh no, did I say that? Is that too soon? Oh, but for now, Terrible Children. In 1, Rule of Rose, and 2, Super Mario World. That will do it for us this week on Original Soundchat. You can find me on Twitter at PeteSpeakEasy. Joe is over at String Pixel. The video version of the show is on the Rhymes with Asia YouTube channel, but it's an MP3 podcast version that you want, and that's hosted by Anonymous Dinosaur at anondino.squarespace.com. That's where Joe's other podcast, Smasher Pieces, is hosted, and you can find Original Soundchat and Smasher Pieces wherever you get your podcasts, captures all around the globe, including Spotify. We have a feed of podcast episodes there, of course, but we also have a video game music playlist. And if we talk about a track on the show and it's on Spotify, gets added to that playlist. Joe, what's being added this week?
Well, like you said earlier, Super Mario World obviously is not on streaming services because it's a first-party Nintendo game, and you know what that means. But Rule of Rose is. And in fact, we were talking about this like off camera. It got just 2 weeks ago, got brand new album art. And I don't know why.
But that's pretty cool, and we're here for it, and we like when we can find video game music on streaming services. Well, when you're done listening, you can find the show on social media at Soundchat OST. Leave some feedback for us, give us some suggestions for games to cover in the future. Joe, who are we talking about next week?
I will be talking about Mary Elizabeth McGlynn.
And I will be talking about Nobuko Toda. Yep. A real strong theme connecting those two games there. But to play us out this week, to highlight a fan cover, a fan remix, whether it's on YouTube, OC Remix, wherever, I had to go back in those old internet memory banks and pull up Hyadane. Hyadane, a classic Japanese YouTube musician who made many great covers over the years on YouTube. Hyadain.
If you watch anime, you probably most know Hyadane nowadays as the person who did the both openings for Nichijou.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if you've never watched those, if you don't watch anime, they're Hyadane goodness. They're fantastic. Also, Nichijou is really good. It's one of the funniest shows I've ever watched. But yeah, that's probably what a lot of people that didn't know him before that would know him for nowadays.
But if Hyadane rings a bell to you, especially if you're older like us, you may be familiar with his work of Western Show on Super Mario World, where he takes that overworld theme and creates a little bit of a lyrical story with Mario, Bowser, and Peach, and a little bit of Luigi. It's a stone cold classic. It's especially famous for an animated, I say animated, but more of like a drawn version that was published by Coco on Nico Nico. Joe, can you believe that both of these were made in 2008? This is 15 years old?
The saddest part is, yeah, I can imagine that. Unfortunately.
Well, if you haven't heard it before, here you go, but just watch the whole thing. Go look it up. So good, and had to be what we ended the show with here. Thank you so much for listening this week on Original Soundchat. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Hey, Koopa, 君ってさし